was quite polite. I wasn't that bad.
Okay, so a bit of a shake-up for everyone, I guess. Can I ask you, you say, we're discussing this whole out-of-touch issue here. Yeah. I would put it to you that you live in a metropolitan area, that you worked as a trader, that you went to private schools, and that you're just as much out of touch with anyone else. What is it that makes this crowd so different?
I've lived in the same village in North Kent for 52 years, and I know absolutely everybody.
So we stay in the village and everything is solved?
To the local publican, and I'm very grounded and very rooted. And, you know, does that influence my thoughts on identity? It probably does, actually, yes. In a sense that I'm very much of that part of the country and that county. And yeah, I had a private education, and I've got to admit I didn't necessarily distinguish myself much there. But no, I think this is about social attitudes. It's about having a conversation. And it's not just the media. I mean, you know, politicians have made this mistake too. I'll give you an example. I went in 2014, the European elections, and what Nick didn't tell you is that I led UKIP in 2014 to being the first party since 1906 that wasn't a Labour or a Tory party that won a national election. I had to get you back on that. But I went in 2014 to Doncaster, a town in Yorkshire, in the north of England, a town with one of the lowest rates of people going on to further education, etc. And I was invited to attend a working man's club. And it was full of ex-miners and people, and I was there at 3 in the afternoon, and they listened. A lot of them were hard left and against me, but a lot were very prepared to listen. And we had a couple of drinks, and I finished up there doing the horses with them on Channel 4 Racing. And 400 yards away was Ed Miliband's constituency office. He's the MP for that seat. And I said to the governor of the Working Man's Club, I said, well, how often does Ed Miliband come in? No, he's never been in. He's never been in, because he wouldn't know how to speak to those people, how to connect with those people. And it's the same with the media. And
so this was just to remind people, Nigel, who don't know, this is the leader of the Labour Party, the leader of the main left party in the UK, did not even go drinking in his own working men's club.
No, and you know yourself that, you know, with the BBC, actually, London and Manchester are the big centres. I mean, you were there in Sunderland on the night, and well done you. But how much time do your reporters spend going around the country? Very little.
Well, I think some of the issues you've raised for us is where we get our staff. The other thing is how we use our staff in terms of picking that up. I think one thing that I wanted to get you to develop, because I think people might be quite surprised by it, I think a number of people seeing you walk out there would think you would say, in a Trump-esque way, you're the corrupt media. I want to see the back of you.
No.
And you said, I want you to get better, and I don't want people to depend on the internet. Why not?
Because, as I've said, I mean, I couldn't have existed without it. It wouldn't have happened. The growth in the UKIP vote that we saw in 2012, which you saw firsthand, which led directly to Cameron making the pledge for the referendum, none of that growth, which took us from being basically a 1% party in the opinion polls to a 6 or 7% party. None of that could have happened without the internet.
But there's something about the internet that you are uncomfortable with.
It can be a force for good. And I've used it. I mean, some of you may think I've used it as a force for bad. I feel I've used it as a force for good. But there is a danger that if the percentage of people trusting mainstream media in terms of their news and how they form their opinions, if that falls much lower than it is, you then have the potential for very bad ideas to gain hold on the internet,
well,
and that is a danger.
What's intriguing about that, in a sense, that's a shared objective. So, the question then, I think, becomes, which may be relevant to people here, which is that conversation you would have at a working man's club. Happened to be in England, could have been in Denmark or Germany or South Africa or wherever, On the internet, anything that was said in that club to you would appear. In other words, even if other people regarded it as offensive, or racist, or uncomfortable, or mad, or untrue, to what extent do you think broadcasters have to, and others in the news media, have to open up a conversation to people they previously would have excluded on the grounds that, frankly, they either didn't know what they were talking about or what they said was unacceptable?
Well, that's why I said you've got to press the reset button. I suggested 4 areas that you've got to talk about: the EU, immigration, radical Islam, and climate change. And I think if as broadcasters you completely rethink how you can talk in Islington, aren't wind farms lovely? But actually, go back to Doncaster and ask people, why is their electricity bill nearly 20% more expensive than it should be, when David Cameron's father-in-law gets paid £1,000 a day for just citing the things on his land? If people saw that kind of debate going on, they would have a great deal more respect.
I suppose I'm pushing you harder than that, though. Yes, we can reset. Yes, we can look at certain issues. I'm also talking about language. It seems to me that part of what went on, and this is a 20-year story, not a 2-year story or a 2-month story, part of what happened in the UK, and I think you're alluding to in Sweden, is that certain views were deemed to be unacceptable. Being unacceptable, they weren't put on the TV or the radio. They were censored from internet sites run by mainstream news media. Question, are you saying anything goes on those sites? Are you saying, no, because your TV are different from the internet, we think you can have some form of
Well, I think you've got
control and
I think you guys have got to shift your agenda, because there are many things that you thought were unacceptable that are now mainstream majority views. I mean, the first time I appeared on Question Time, which is our big weekly chat show, which Nick wants to take over at some point, but at the minute there's someone there. But the first time I appeared on Question Time in 2000, David Dimbleby, the long-term chair of it, there was a talk about the EU and what should happen. And Dimbleby said, and you, Nigel Farage, you have even admitted that you think Britain should leave the European Union. I mean, you think I'd endorse paedophilia? It was quite extraordinary. And that coming, from the flagship programme. So even saying we should leave the EU was deemed to be unacceptable.
But is that then because that's the way we've normally talked, because we are, in the mainstream media is kind of well-educated, civilized, we don't, there's a certain amount of issues we don't go into? Or is it simply, do you think, bias on part of the journalists and of the editors?
I think if you draw your staff, I repeat the point, from middle or upper middle classes, predominantly privately educated, mostly been to good universities, live inside the metropolitan London bubble, you have a completely different set of social views to those who live 100 kilometres away.
I think what you're saying, let's just be clear, because I think it'll help us for the conversation as we go on, is that, take your Swedish example. I think what you're saying is you want people in that newsroom who say, hey, do you know what, my mum, my friend, my builder, the guy I play pool with, he doesn't want these refugees in. And you think that conversation is not taking place? It's
not been taking place. I think there are two things. Firstly, the conversation's not been taking place. And secondly, I think the language, frankly, I'm talking about the UK here, but the language that has been used on the big talk shows, on the big programmes, on the programme that you are involved with 3 or 4 days a week, I think very often the language itself just doesn't connect with ordinary people. You see an endless series of politicians who use acronyms which you have to explain during the interviews. And I think one of the reasons why Trump succeeded, even if he appalled people, and perhaps one of the reasons I've moved on a bit in British politics, is we've used the language, we've talked about things, and whether people agree with it or disagree with it, they understand it and they remember it.
And is that the key then, do you think, to Trump's success? Because some people have said he wasn't even challenged on some of the things that he said were obviously wrong, that could be, factually checked. But the whole fact-checking system doesn't work because he was appealing to people's feelings?
Well, Trump clearly made some mistakes in the campaign and did stand up more than once and apologise for being over the top and shooting from the hip and getting things wrong. But my point is, he used a form of words, he used a language, he dared to broaden the boundaries of debate, and that's in the end what won in the election. I mean, come on, they targeted it at the Midwest, didn't they? That was what the Trump team went for, and he managed to get a lot of people to turn out to vote who haven't voted probably ever in their lives.
But in the process, there may be people thinking, well, hold on, yes, he did, and you could admire it as a piece of strategy. But if in the process you've made every Muslim in the United States feel alienated, And you were criticised, let's remember, you were criticised because you raised the issue of the danger of infections coming in the UK from immigrants. And some people thought you were playing this deliberately to outrage.
I didn't raise the issue of infections coming into the United Kingdom. I raised the issue of who was going to pay.
For people who had to be treated.
Yes.
But my point was this, was not to re-go over that ground, right? Now, I'm sure there are people here, I know there are people elsewhere who think Trump said what he said about Muslims to be outrageous, to have what is often called in the UK the dog whistle, the idea that the electorate would think, he's a little bit racist like I am and it's acceptable. And forgive me, they said that about you. They thought you said things about disease and immigration as a deliberate way of saying, hey, look, they don't think like you, but I do think like you. And the question for broadcasters is, do we just say, look, say what you like. We'll be in touch, you say what you like. Or isn't it our job to say, hold on, no, that's wrong?
No, I think I would agree with that. Of course, you've got a responsibility. If you think something's clearly wrong, you've got to act on it. And that line of Trump's clearly was over the top. Which is why he then changed it quite rapidly to extreme vetting. Look, I'm not for one moment suggesting that mainstream media has to become a total free-for-all like the internet is. What I am suggesting is that mainstream media has got out of touch with over half the population in all of these countries because it's too metropolitan, it's drawing from too narrow a group of people. And as I said, the question for me is not, is the BBC biased? It's, does it think it's biased? It doesn't think it is, because actually, socially, it's not representative of the country as a whole.
And isn't that just a lovely point to bring in some of the people that you're talking about? We've actually gathered a small panel to talk to you. They're coming in now. And the people you'll be meeting now is Katie Searle, who is the editor of BBC Westminster, John Williams, who is the managing editor of ABC News. We must admit he's a Brit also, so you'll be comfortable. And it's Ece Temelkuran from Turkey, and Charlotte Raab, who is Deputy Head of Politics with the AFP in France, possibly the next country to face the same challenges that the UK and the US have faced. Katie, let me begin with you. You're biased, but you don't even know it. You're socially biased.
I completely reject that. I mean, I think I wouldn't say we were biased in any way. I mean, I was pleased to see that you were very clear that in our campaign coverage that we got it right.
Yes.
That was a relief. I didn't see that coming.
I'm very objective.
I would absolutely reject that we were biased. I think there is a point about our social makeup in how we employ our staff. I can tell you that I neither went to private school nor university, so I've got one in there. But a lot of my colleagues,
you're the only one.
A lot of my colleagues did, and I accept that. And I think actually, if you look at what we've been doing over the last couple of years, we've been setting up a lot of programs to bring in different types of people. So we are addressing that. I wouldn't actually call it bias. I think a better word might be a slight blindness, actually, because when you send people out into the regions, and we did that again and again and again, it's really kind of taking notice of that. And the difficulty is saying, okay, when is something that you have captured on a day or in a week something that has become a trend? And what we saw during the campaign, I think, was you only had to look at the pictures of the Boris bus and the campaign and the people around that you noticed the excitement around that. And I think what we didn't do enough of is really tap into our colleagues that are across the country, as you know, our regional colleagues, and say, what does this mean? And I think that's true of the campaign in 2015 as well.
Let's bring in John. I mean, John, you were working a very prominent position on ABC News during this election. Do you think the same criticism, the same question applies? And frankly and personally, it might apply to you, which is people might say, well, what the hell is a senior executive of ABC News doing who is not an American? And therefore, by definition, is what Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, called a citizen of nowhere.
Right. Well, on that, fortunately, as a citizen of everywhere, as a Brit reporting the world to America, I think there is some value in that. I think the lesson from Brexit and from the US election is the same, and it's the point that Katie made. When ABC and the other networks actually went and talked to voters, Then, of course, we picked up the enthusiasm for Donald Trump. The truth is, we didn't do it enough. And too much of it was the horse race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and perhaps not enough about the issues that the voters were actually concerned about. And I think for all of us, both in Europe and in the United States, the period of reflection needs to be that we need to talk more to our audience, to the voters, and perhaps less to ourselves.
Mr. Farage, would that do the difference, do you think?
Well, that's right. I mean, I think, you know, I was very praiseworthy of the way you covered the referendum, and rightly so. But what I'm going to do, here's a file of correspondence between your Director General and Newswatch of the coverage that we've seen on the BBC since June the 23rd. If you just tuned in, not even to political programmes, but to social programmes on Radio 4 in the United Kingdom, you would think that Brexit means apocalypse now. So please have those letters and have a look at them. No, do.
Actually, in your introduction, you said that there wasn't a single programme that was on air from the BBC that said we're excited about Brexit. And I want to put that back to you and say, is that our job to be excited by it? I think actually it's much more our job to look at what it is, because we're not getting any answers from the government. So surely we exist to try and ask those questions. And the problem is, as we all know, there are so many questions. So that's what we've got to do, not be excited about something we don't know what it is yet.
Yes, but if you're going to have a whole series of programmes telling us that dreadful things will happen to the farming industry, food prices are going through the roof, it's all going to be a disaster for the housing market. If you have a series of programmes that say that, you do need somewhere to pop on an optimist. I'll come on. I'll tell him how good
I can't get you off. I can't get you off.
Yeah. But let's continue to explore the point I think Haiti was alluding to, which is reporting from outside the metropolis.
Yeah.
You raised that point about the origin of journalism, but also the reporting. And maybe we can bring Charlotte as well in for a perspective on France here as well.
This is very much a concern that we at the AFP have. We actually have a working group at the AFP, which is called Trump Brexit, and which is thinking about how to improve our coverage, how to make sure our coverage is accurate, and how we take the pulse of the population as it is.
And you explicitly call it Trump Brexit. In other words, you are explicitly...
It's an email lister. Yeah. And there's been a meeting already, and we specifically brought in very few people from the politics department, which I'm a part of, and people who report from the suburbs, from the province, from the various departments of the agency, to make sure and to think about how to cover the issues that are on people's mind. And there are lots of ideas being floated around to go beyond the horse race coverage, which is what my department is tasked with.
But is that, in your opinion, a general problem, that we seem to be focusing on the wrong issues, that we're focusing on who is going to win? I'm going to put this to you also, John, that we were focused on who is going to win. The percentages is now 80% the chance for Clinton to win and less for Trump. That we're on, as we discussed yesterday, we're on the campaign more than being actually on the choice and the things that matter to people.
We have to do both. We can't do one without doing the other, and we have to understand why is Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so running ahead in that precinct. Why is this idea carrying so much weight in that region?
But at AFP, aren't you in a slightly tricky position? I mean, your relationship with the European Commission, financial grants that you've had from European institutions, doesn't that leave you in a slightly difficult position to cover the Eurosceptic issue in next year's election and to be seen to be objective?
I don't believe so. I mean, you can challenge us and, look through our production, and I think you'll see that there are no bias and there is no litmus test as to, how people get hired and what the reporting is.
I want to see if we can develop this argument, though, about whether you cover the choice, as it were, rather than the campaign. Because if you go back to Mr. Farage's point about why he got no coverage in 1999, the answer was the way the BBC determines coverage is by the amount of support you have, and at the time he had very little support. One of the issues, I think, for all of us going forward is the speed of transition from being nothing to being a powerful political movement has now is in months. It used to be in decades sometimes. You know, the Labour Party took a long time to develop. And therefore the old model that says we decide whether to cover someone on the basis of whether they won an election 4 years ago and whether they have this many members of parliament. We decide whether to cover a particular issue on the grounds of what the opinion polls a month ago told us. Maybe these measures are the things that are, in a way, distorting our coverage, John.
I agree with that. And I think, you know, the real lesson is for us to go back to basics, which is to do journalism. And it's less about simply, you know, what is trending that day. You know, I think that the challenge for all of my colleagues in the US over the next 4 years is to really double down on investigative journalism. There are lots of, you know, issues that, that need to be looked at. Our job, our principal role, is to hold people to account. And a different type of White House is going to require different type of coverage. And we can't just apply the same way that we have covered the Obama White House or the Bush White House to a different White House. But that means doing journalism. And, you know, to Nigel's point, you know, that's a great challenge for all of us, which is to do our jobs better. And there can be, you know, no greater challenge to us than to rise to that challenge.
Absolutely, but at the same time, we're all working in the office every day. We all have daily deadlines. We all do daily... I was just discussing this with myself and my colleagues many times during this campaign, because you want the daily news, and you have an election to cover, and there are issues that are important, but at the same time, you want to do a program that has this today feeling, this, you know, this just happened, this just in, with, you know, you want to be live and stay focused.
But
Doesn't that counter?
It can't all be urgent. And I think one of the things that we perhaps need to reflect upon is whether in our enthusiasm to be of the moment, we lose sight of sort of doubling down on what it is that the audience and the voters are actually making their choices about. And so, you know, there is something about delving into the issues and not just reporting the horse race.
I think the problem is with that, and I accept that, and I think we should do more, and we try and do more. In the end, it's just a bit boring. And, you know, the more exciting stuff, Tina, as you say, is the argument between the, you know, the top politicians or something you've said. And in the end, I just don't think that's going to change.
But if at the end of the day, all we've done is do the exciting, and we've got it wrong, then actually our reputation is massively damaged.
Well, it's what Charlotte said. You have to do both, absolutely. But we are kidding ourselves if we're not going to do the more exciting one first. We just are.
Charlotte, I want to ask you this question because in a sense you face the dilemma now. I think what Katie is saying about news in the UK, let's apply it to you. Let's say that Marine Le Pen says something incredibly controversial. Francois Fillon falls over while doing something and look like he's ill. Are you really going to not cover her comments or his fall because you've decided that the people of southwest France feel very strongly about, you know, the EU isn't their thing? You won't. You'll do the news.
Right, yeah, I think...
So how does coverage actually change? In other words, you're our test case. These guys, they've done it. They've already got it wrong. No, I'm just teasing. But the test case is, give us an example, if you have one in your head, of something you might do now that if we'd asked you a year ago, you wouldn't have done.
I mean, we do fact-checking. Fact-checking is a lot more systematic than it ever was. And now when we cover the debates, for example, the recent political debates, we had a fact-checking team with us in the same room, sitting at on our same desk as us. So that's indispensable.
But I would say that fact-checking, you know, if I were to be a bit polemic, I would say that fact-checking is out of touch because people don't care about the facts. They rely on, is it a charismatic person? Did he look stupid when he fell over? Did she do well in, you know, is that really what people want?
Well, to that, I wonder whether, you know, the question that we need to ask is whether a different type of politics requires a different type of coverage. Yeah. And the thing that I take away from the last 6 months is that we perhaps have applied the same old model to a different type of world.
Yeah. I want to bring Ece in just 2 seconds. Just before you do, Ece, because you've got a lot of experience of this in Turkey and dealing with President Erdogan. For people who don't know, Nigel, do you remember the quote from Aaron Banks, big funder of yours, big supporter of yours about facts?
No.
Okay. He basically said facts don't matter anymore.
Yeah, but he wasn't...
Basically, just to explain, before you knock it down, let me just explain to people what people I'm referring to. So a big funder of Mr. Farage has basically said facts don't matter anymore. In a sense, is that you're very generously doing it, but there's a curiosity. Here we are talking as if we're all on the same side. Maybe what you've discovered about politics is, actually, it's not facts that get you elected at all. It's emotion.
My strategy for the referendum was... Yeah, do you know what? You can argue we'll be 5 billion a year better off or 5 billion a year worse off, and the public, the eyes will just completely glaze over because they won't have a clue who to believe, which is why I went for the slogan, "We want our country back." I was appealing to people's hearts, and I think on that issue, on what immigration from Eastern Europe had done to our communities, actually what was happening was people were saying to me, do you know, when you speak, you say the same things we're saying at our dinner table every night. So somehow, the political class, the media class, missed something quite big socially that was going on.
Ece's been waiting incredibly patiently there. Just to remind you, Ece is a Turkish journalist who's had a fair amount of clashes with the Erdogan
No,
regime.
Mr. Farage is right about something. This feels like a funeral, and he seems to be the only confident person about his thoughts in this meeting. And I think this discussion should be shaping not only around Trump or Brexit, but on a more global scale. I can understand that it might feel, intimidating for a European or American citizen to know that there are similarities between Turkey and, Britain or America. But actually, there are. And we've been through this. Like 15 years ago. I know that Turkey looks like one of the most insane countries at the moment where anything can happen. Therefore, nobody wants to make similarities in between Turkey or Britain or United States. But actually, it wasn't so insane 15 years ago. And it actually started, ironically, with this question, are we out of touch? And then, a lot of self-beating from elite, so-called elite. And the word elite became quite condescending. Therefore, we chose to include people like Mr. Farage, of course, less sweet versions of him, and more harsh. And then the next thing you know, you recognize their ideas. And then in order to be not pigeonholed as the oppressive elite, you start respecting these ideas. And at the end, after 15 years, you find yourself, if you should marry the minors to their rapists, like we did a few weeks ago. It might sound, completely bizarre, unacceptable. But then, talking about, marrying the minors to their rapists, like it happened a few weeks ago, is actually, in its very core, is so similar to, for instance, CNN discussing whether we should discuss about alt-right's vision of Jews whether being humans or not. It begins with this question, are we out of touch? And then self-beating, are we elites? Are we too cosmopolitan? And so on and so forth. And then we end up in this, insanity. So we have to be careful about this. And think globally, actually.
Are you saying the conference is actually making a mistake? He won't mind. He's not used to people like him, right? I think you're saying, and I'm encouraging you to if you are, that Mr. Farage here is a sort of wolf in sheep's clothing. That he's being nice to us, and we're being nice to him, because we're all learning. But if we go down the route he's saying, I think you're saying, we end up with a sort of journalism which accommodates ideas that are extreme, which accommodates views that should not be accommodated. Is that what you're warning?
Well, actually, people, and all of us, most of us, tend to speak about this trust issue. Loss of trust issue in terms of Facebook, digital media, and so on and so forth. And I think we should be more courageous and to look, enough courageous to look at this on the ideological level. We lost the trust not because Facebook is spreading fake news. We lost the trust, I don't know, during Gulf War, when, tragedy of a country was the fireworks for the United States, for other countries. Or we lost trust in Tahrir, when people decided to trust the, nickname, Twitter users instead of New York Times, which invested millions of dollars in its logo in order to be trusted.
Yeah.
So it is not only technology, it's not only digital. I think we should take this discussion further than the level of fact-checking or, digital media and so on and so forth. This is an ideological war, actually, and it will become an ideological war in the United States as well. It's not only about politics even, I'm so sorry, but it's about clash of system of values. It will become like that very soon.
And many people are facing this issue right now. Let's go to the front row, because we have down here the Deputy Director of News for ZDF, Elmar Tefesen. You are, I would say, if I was to be polemic, which I'm not, obviously, a part of the Lügenpresse, as somebody has called you. But you are facing elections. They're coming up next year. How will you make sure that you don't, I was going to say, alienate the people that have deep feelings, for instance, about immigration, whilst not going the way that Etche warns us against?
Actually, of course, we have the AfD, who had succeeded in several regional elections in this year. So there is a big discussion in Germany about the issue. And I think that we have to come to the conclusion that we cannot and should not treat them differently than any other politician in Germany as well. That's my personal opinion, and I think that media in Germany are on the way to realizing that and doing that. And
have you treated them differently?
Yes, I think that we didn't treat them as the new kids on the block, but as the filthy kids on the block. But there's a good reason to it, wonderful. And if I may, I'd like to explain that briefly. I think that populists like Mr. Farage are nothing else than the extension, or you might call it the exaggeration, or even the caricature of the politicians that we had over the past decades. Meaning that all of them were basically telling people that we can promise you progress and wealth without you having to pay any price for it, or having somebody else somewhere in the world paying a price for globalization and progress and those kinds of things. And that's the very same thing that Mr. Farage and all the others do, withholding the truth. And we have been, in my view, supporting that in the media because, and I give you two examples. One is when we choose a soundbite in many of our organizations, we always or mostly choose the most controversial and emotional soundbite and not necessarily the most substantial soundbite. And I think that gave a rise to that trend that you get away with that kind of populism. And to give you the bigger example, we forgot to connect the dots. For example, if you talk about Syria, how many of us have reported that in 2006 the EU made an agreement with the Assad regime, an association agreement of the European Union with the Assad regime, which was never ratified, but Syria started to change their political landscape and system, made, for example, the health system private and commercial, so people had to pay, and many other things. So we, in part, created the mess that we're in, but we forgot to tell the story. Let me just finish that briefly up.
I just wanted to ask you about a specific example. Could I do that?
Sorry?
I just wanted to ask you about a specific example in your coverage, if I may, which is the refugee crisis. As I understand it, I wasn't here a year ago, but at the conference a year ago, there was a debate provoked by the fact that German news organizations, in TV in particular, would not use the word migrant, use the word refugees. And then I wanted to get Mr. Farage to respond to that. Did you not create, in part, the very problem you're now having to wrestle with?
I agree that we have not really listened enough to the people. I agree on that. But I don't think that just because somebody is demanding, we should throw overboard some rules in Germany that we actually have for a good reason. During the Nazi regime, people were actually the government was using the ethnic background of people in connection with criminal cases or criminal events to really tell the public that the Jews were behind it or the Sinti and Roma were behind it and so on. So therefore, we had a rule that you have to be reluctant to call out the ethnic background if it's not directly related to the case and important to understand the case.
Yep.
So I think there's a good reason to not throw that overboard. But I have to add one thing. So what do we have to do differently? I think we don't have to treat the politicians or the populace differently from any other politician. We have we have to change the way we treat politicians, meaning we have to ask the questions that the people have about the solutions. And we also have to come up with formats that help us to do that. Maybe it's a good idea to throw politicians into a room, into an escape room, and ask them for a solution, and they cannot get out before they actually come up with the solution.
They'll be in there for a while.
That's my last sentence, if I may.
Last sentence, okay.
If we do that, then we will have more informed citizens, we will have more responsible politicians, and less populists like Mr. Farage and Donald Trump.
I think we're having a really interesting conversation, but I'm still worried it's too polite a conversation.
Well, it won't be now.
I don't want us to be polite.
It won't be now.
We are, let's be clear what we're talking about. We are talking in France of the possibility someone who would widely be regarded as a Nazi by some people becoming the next president. In AfD, there are parties that people regard as Nazis. Now, there are plenty of people who don't. But let's stop being too polite. What I'm trying to get to the bottom of, I want to go back to the question I asked you about the pub, Nigel.
Yeah, I love pubs.
If in that pub, in that bar, there are people saying, and I'm going to say it, refugees, they're dirty, they rape our women, they have values, they shouldn't come in, should that be part of our coverage?
Well,
or are we saying that crosses a line, it's unacceptable, it won't be said? Get Nigel first.
Is not right,
I think what we got wrong last year, and you're quite right, it was this use of words, wasn't it? Hardly any of the roughly 1.8 million people that came into the EU last year, hardly any of them would have qualified as refugees under the Geneva Convention.
That's not true.
They would.
That's not true. I'm sorry. We talked about facts, and we talked about holding people to account.
Yeah.
That is not true.
Yes, it is.
If you are fleeing Syria, you are unquestionably a refugee.
Well, you are a displaced person.
No. Under international law, you are a refugee and you are entitled to protection. You are not a migrant.
I tried very hard to make a plea for the refugee case for the Christians in Syria.
But to our colleague's point, it's irrelevant.
And I was told that religion had nothing to do with it. Actually, traditionally, with people being granted refugee status, religion nearly always is absolutely at the core of it. So there is a fundamental imbalance here between how I feel on this and you feel on this.
Right, because I've been
to
Syria 5 times since the civil war began. And I have seen the suffering that actually, I believe, personally, the West has not done enough to protect people who are fleeing being bombed by their own government. Those are refugees. They are not migrants. They are not economic migrants.
According to the UNHCR, there are 59 million displaced people through wars and conflicts around the world. Right. When we talk traditionally about refugees, we're talking about people under the Geneva Convention who are going to be persecuted because of their ethnicity, their race, their orientation, or their views. And as I say, hardly any of the 1.8 million directly came into that category. But what's interesting is, that's the issue, but we're talking about the media here. What's really interesting is the German doublespeak that we've just had from the front row. On the one hand, we've listened. Oh, well, yeah, we've listened. We're going to treat the AfD normally. Then I'm called a populist liar. Why am I a populist? Is that because I represent a kind of politics that you don't like? So I'm not on. So I'm not on a democratic equivalent to anybody else.
You're using falsehoods.
So you use this
You're using falsehoods and lies to further your political cause and recruit people.
We don't
You're talking about Islamization of Europe.
Yeah.
There is none. If you look at the numbers and the empirical research, there is none. But you're using it to instill fear into the people in order to get the votes from those people. You don't
something?
have any
Do you know something?
solutions to the problem.
Do you know something?
You are lying, Mr. Farage.
You know, your deep prejudice, and maybe...
No, we can discuss the numbers if you like.
Maybe mainstream media is going down the tubes if people like you stay in senior positions. I didn't even mention the issue of Islam once. I didn't mention it once.
Hold on.
I
You mentioned the radical Islam.
I said
For
you need to
Islam
talk
is
about
all
it.
the same.
Now, you're very good at talking. Try a bit of listening. Maybe all of you should do a little bit more of that. I did not mention the issue of the Islamization of Europe. I didn't mention it once. Didn't talk about it at all in the referendum campaign. Not once. It was not even part of our debate or part of our narrative. But the idea that we'll... Actually, you're the people that have been lying. You're the ones that have been telling us the euro would be good for us.
Sorry,
political union would be good for us.
You and UKIP
why are our
together
views
with all the
unacceptable?
right-wing populist parties in Europe, in the European Parliament, who are actually making this case that we are facing an Islamization of Europe.
But I don't sit with them, do I?
In those,
but I don't sit with them, do I? Or don't you know that?
Oh, you had conversations, plenty of them, with them.
In the coffee room. Bloody hell, I must have done something awful.
No, I'm sorry. UKIP is coordinating in part some of the actions, the political action and propaganda with other parties, like the AfD in Germany.
It's very sweet of you to think of me, you know, sitting somewhere, stroking a white cat, planning the downfall of Western civilization. But I'm sorry to tell you it's not true. And I find it remarkable that just because I have a different view of the world to you, all you can do is throw abuse, call me a liar, and say I'm a populist. And it says more about you than it does about me.
We can talk about the numbers. You are refusing to do that.
Let me just be clear what fact you're trying to get to the bottom of. What are you alleging that Mr. Farage has said?
That the right-wing populists in Europe across the board are basically using the numbers of increasing the number of Muslims in Europe, basically telling people that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, there will be a Muslim majority in Europe, which is plainly wrong. And if you look at the numbers, then you can see that, but this is withheld by those parties. Let
Mr. Farage answer, and then I want to bring Katie in. I think Edgy.
Well, this is not part of my debate. I mean, I'm not worried about Islam at all. And we have a lot of... I've had significant Islamic support, activists joining my party. I'm worried about radical Islam, and I'm worried that people like you might not be actually telling the truth about it.
Katie Zill, BBC.
On something you've touched on, and bring it back to Brexit, if I can. Because I think one of the questions really we should be asking is not whether we've lost trust in the media, but whether we've lost trust in our politicians. And I think if you look at the debate around Brexit, what happened was both sides, both campaigns, clearly claiming things they said were facts that were very, very loosely based on facts. I could put it that way. Some people would say they were lies. In fact, I think it would be fairer to say they were loosely based on what they could argue as facts if you came from their position on it. And I think that is a real challenge for us, because every day it was our job, of course, to report the campaign. And what we did at the BBC was we had our own fact check, reality check, which got a lot of recognition and was very successful online, and was really, really important that we do that. But you know, it was a real challenge to try and hold the politicians to account every single day for every single claim, because as we know, if we just take the 350, for example, they got a hit if we just showed that number. They didn't care, actually, if we were saying, well, actually, there are real questions about that. The figure was on the screen, and that's a concern.
Edgy, I think you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah. This, you know, has been going on in Turkey for 15 years, and it's so happy for me to watch this, because I thought we couldn't do it. It's obviously nobody can, because it is this pattern, and this pattern is, as well, has been repeated for millions of times. And there are passwords to it. It's like, I don't know if you heard these words. I know them because I heard them for years. Point of view, your prejudice, and you don't listen, and so on. These are the, you know, almost the magical, often same words of these patterns. And you're going, no, this is not the fact. This is not the fact. We have been in this for such a long time, therefore now I know the pattern, and you cannot go beyond the pattern by mocking, you know, Farage or Mr. Farage or like people, like New Yorker did for months for Trump. Or you cannot go, this is not the fact, this is not the fact. I'm sorry, I'm all for you, but then, this doesn't work in a greater scale. And what I wanted to tell was, if you go into this, without being aware that you are falling into a loop, if you go into this loop, they always win. Because their phrase, their line is always more catchy than yours. Because you said, look at the numbers. That's the end of the conversation, because nobody look at numbers.
And this is a very good point. Let's go to the front row again, but to your neighbor, to Jimmy Mayman of the AOL, Executive Vice President of AOL and a former Huffington Post chief. You really, you went into this during the election. You posted in Huffington Post, at the end of each article about Donald Trump, there was a disclaimer. And the disclaimer should come on the screen now. Donald Trump is a serial liar, a rampant xenophobe, racist, misogynist, murderer and bully who has repeatedly pledged to ban all Muslims, 1.6 billion members of an entire religion, from entering the US. That was the editor's note at the end of each Trump article. Was that a wise choice, do you think?
Sometimes you have to do things that are not necessarily wise. No, in hindsight, obviously, this is not a wise choice. As you also said, I'm not the editor-in-chief of Huffington Post, and I believe in state and church. So, obviously, if this is their point of view, they should make that heard. That being said, HuffPost was created, and I think media in general was created on starting and having conversations, and obviously, if you're putting this next to your coverage and your articles, you're not kind of having those conversations, because you're obviously excluding the people that you want to have that conversation with, and it becomes very isolated, and I think that's a problem, and I think. If we take a step back and look broader at what's been going on in the U.S. In this cycle and the broader media ramifications, we just heard, the sound bites versus the investigative journalism is something that we've seen more and more of. In March, there was a big study done. At that point in time, because we were so interested in the sound bites, Trump had gotten $2 billion of free media. To comparison, Hillary at that point was at 700, and obviously, easy to see why this is happening. It's easier to take those soundbites, and Donald has played that game very, very well. But also, what we just heard a second ago, the thing is, we were not holding him accountable, right? First time he went on CNN, Huffington Post put 5 journalists to do fact-checking. He lied 71 times. He's the guy that's now the president.
And yet he got elected.
He got elected. And I think, that is, we have to accept, as we are also hearing in this panel, we have to accept that the way media has to be in order to resonate with the public, we need to understand the public better. And I think what you've also seen is you've seen this move from local news to national news coverage. If you look at 12 versus 16 election, a lot of the local news outlets has actually died in the US, which means that you don't have the ear to the ground anymore. Meaning in the local communities, you saw all the news organizations dropping in people for a week, and then they think they know what's going on. Obviously, they don't know what's going on if they drop in people for a week. They have to live there, as we heard from Mr. Farage. You have to understand what these people are talking about, what are their problems, what are their issues, what are they really caring about. I think we've also lost that because we lost local media, and we haven't fixed that. And I think also, 2 other points, and then I'll hand it back, is that the shift that we've seen from broadcasting traditional media to social media. This is the first time you've had a president that was elected on social media, and I honestly believe he was elected on social media. And there's a problem when you have the biggest platform in the world, denying that they're a media platform, not just a platform, and obviously not wanting to work with the media industry and organizations on how do we course correct, how do we work better with that, because otherwise we're basically, the future is a Kafka's future, where an algorithm is deciding who's gonna win and who's gonna lose, and I don't believe that is the future. That's how we're seeing the future for ourselves. One last thing that I will say, I do think there's hope. I think if you look at both Brexit and also the US election, I think if you look at the young generation, the millennials, the majority of those actually have a bright view on the future. They have a global mindset. They do not want to close down shop. They actually believe in what's happening. The problem is we don't know how to talk to them, right? We don't know as media organizations. We're not talking to these people, and they're not showing up when they actually have to vote.
One of the quotes of the election cycle, John, that's been endlessly reheated, but is a thought-provoking one, I think was put by the founder of PayPal, I've forgotten his name now, forgive me, who said the problem was that we, in the media, took Trump literally, but not seriously, and we should have taken him seriously, but not literally. Now, what I think he means by that is that when, for example, Trump said, build a wall, instead of within 5 minutes saying, who'd build a wall? That'd be crazy. Do you know how much it would cost to build a wall? You must be mad. This was a symbol of him saying, a lot of people think our immigration system is out of control and something dramatic and new has to happen. And that could have been a prompt for the media to examine that at length. Now, that may well have been fact-checking the idea of building a wall and getting the Mexicans to pay for it. But do you think that's one way in which journalism could do it slightly differently?
Well, that's why I say I think a different type of White House requires a different type of coverage. And, you know, I come back to this point that we have no higher task than to hold people to account.
Yep.
And even if it was literal, there is merit in, and you know, interestingly, he is going to build a wall, and he has, you know, he has said privately to people since the election. Now, in places it may be a fence, but it's certainly going
Privately
to be
in certain conversations that certain people have had with him in private, I've heard.
Did he tell you he was going to build a wall?
It's going to be a big, beautiful wall. I'm looking forward to seeing
a
it.
huge wall, I think is. But you know, I think there is certainly some truth in the fact that whether it's Nigel or whether it's Donald Trump, you know, we have not adapted to a different type of them doing their business. And there is a problem, I think, that we've not adapted fast enough to the changing environment that we face.
But don't you think the ground rules changed more than we thought? I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. We will be coming back to you.
Yeah, sure.
We will continue the discussion, but we just have to move on because I mean, we could go on for ages here. But we will talk more. But I was